our sites over the next month to prepare for Pesach, and may the Rebbe Shalom give us all the strength not only to go on but to go on fully healthy, and we should all be zeicha to a lot of nachas, and certainly we have a great hakara. The whole community should probably participate in a Sudas Haidah at some point when we're largely back to where we were and have one big Sudas Haidah. Thanking the Rebbe Shalom. Okay, so we're on Yud Zayin Amud Aleph, and we just started something that we're going to continue. So I just want to step back a few lines. Let's see. We are. Okay, so I want to just back up to about 5 or 6 lines from where the wide lines begin. Okay, that's really the beginning of the discussion that we're going to pick up today. So there, we said Amr Rav Asi Rabbi Yochanan. About 6 lines from where the wide lines begin. Rav Asi says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and we said this briefly at the end of last week, Hamotzi shtar chov b'shuk, if someone finds a shtar chov, a regular obligation, not a special obligation, but a regular obligation in the shuk, because of bo handpick, and there was a certification in it, meaning that the love acknowledged that he had borrowed the money, because of bo zmano bo bayom. So remember, this was the case where the document found had a date, the very date that you're finding it. So let's say.
I'm sorry, what daf are we on? I apologize.
Say again.
What daf?
Yud Zayin Amud Aleph.
Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. Thank you. Sorry.
About 6 slides from the bottom.
Thank you.
So shtar chov b'shuk. So if it has a certification and it's dated the day that you find it, that means today. It's dated today, and today you found the document. So l'chayra, you would think, wow, I found the document today. So what's going on? You say yachziru l'balim. You return it to the creditor, to the balim, to the ones who own it, and we say imishum kosav lilvos v'lo love. If you're afraid that of that which we were afraid of in the very beginning, that maybe they wrote it and it wasn't, he didn't borrow the money till later. In other words, there would be a gap or kosav bo handpick. He wrote a handpick. The handpick is the certification that the borrower says, yes, I borrowed. So we're not worried about a Nisan Tishrei kind of borrowing that we were afraid of. Imishum Peron, if maybe he paid it back. Lepriya bas yom ala chashinan. So the Gemara establishes the rule that people don't pay back the same day they borrow. That was the principle of what propelled us here in this case, is that if I borrow today, I don't pay you back today. Metzias, no one pays back the day they borrow. That's the statement of Rav Asi Rabbi Yochanan. Amar Rav Zera Rav Asi. Rav Zera asked Rav Asi, "Mir Rabbi Yochanan Hachi, did you say this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? Did Rabbi Yochanan say such a thing? Well, Atu Merit, you yourself said Mishmeid Rabbi Yochanan, Shtar Shalovavo, Uparo Eina Choza Velovavo." In other words, remember the case. If you use a document to secure a loan, and that shtar chov allows you to get paid back from the purchasers of the borrower's property, meaning it's a certified document, and he pays it back. So Rabbi Yochanan says, "Ein choizev v'loivabo." You can't use the same document to borrow a second time. Shekvar nimchul shibudo. And we had this discussion last week. In other words, once that document is used one time and it refers to a specific loan, you can't say, well, I'm going to borrow the same $100, so why bother writing another document? I'll use the same document. So Rabbi Yochanan says you can't use the same document and therefore rely that if the debtor doesn't pay, that you're going to get it from the lekuchos, from the person who buys his property. So it's a secure property. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says. Amos So the Gemara says, wait a minute. If it happened the next day or day after, my shibudo. Why does the Gemara have to say that the shibud fell off, and that's why you can't use it? Typically, the havale mukdam. Let's say that it was a predated shtar. Utnan shtarit chov hamukdam psulin. So in other words, the Gemara is asking a question there. If you're saying, Rabbi Yochanan says, that you can't borrow and use the same shtar chov a second time, wait a minute. If it happened the next day, then of course you can't use it. It's a shtar mukdam. It's dated yesterday. You want to use it today. Why are you coming to tell me something about, oh, it's a shibud and the shibud fell off and therefore you can't use it? It's simply a shtar mukdam. That's the most straightforward way of explaining it. And a shtar mukdam, the Mishnah says, is possible. Elala biyoma. So we have to interpret that Rabbi Yochanan's case is not about the next day, it's about the same day. That on the same day he borrowed, he wants to repay and borrow again. Alma paroi inish biyoma. So you see that a person does pay back the same day and he wants to borrow again on the same shtar. That's the kasha. The kasha is, we're not worried about the shibud part of it. We want to extract from this that you see a person borrows, pays back on the same day because he's borrowing again on the same shtar. So you see, you're making a point that a person doesn't borrow on the same day. You see, the person does borrow on the same day because that's the only way we can interpret Rabbi Yochanan's case. Omale. So he says back then, Mikan mina deloy proy klau. I didn't say that he never pays back. I mean to say that it's not likely that he'll pay. Yeah, in some cases he'll pay back, so we have a different teretz for that. But most likely, a person doesn't pay back on the same day. Therefore, it's more likely than not that it fell from the hands of the creditor, and we pay and we return it to the creditor. Yeah, Jay.
Excuse me, Jonathan, do you have any names to announce for Shlema? Jonathan Fine just showed up. I don't, your mic is muted.
Maryasha Meta but Risha Miriam.
Maryasha Meta Risha Miriam.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So in other words, so we give the teretz that it's not likely that a person pays on that day, and therefore that validates what Rabbi Yochanan said, that you can return it to the creditor. Now, here we're going to pick up, and we're going to say as follows. Rav Kana Omar, Rav Kana wants to give a different teretz as to why you give it to the malveh, the creditor in this case. Rav Kana Omar, Kishechayev Modeh. A novel theory that you know why you give it to the creditor, because the debtor admitted that he owes the loan. In other words, it's very simple. The debtor admits he owes the loan, and therefore we give it to the creditor. Frank, the Gemara, what are you telling me? You're telling me that you know why Rabbi Yochanan says you return it to the creditor is because the debtor admitted he owes the loan. So he's Malamema. Of course, if the debtor says he owes it, you give it to the creditor. What kind of chiddush? I mean, Rav Kana is. We're going through this whole machination of trying to understand why you return it to the creditor, and we say because it's not likely someone pays back the same day. It's possible, but not likely. So Rav Kana wants to come and say, no, I don't even have to come to that. We're talking about a case where the debtor admits he owes the loan. Frank, the Gemara Malamemra, of course, says the Gemara, no. Ma'u detema. I would have thought if he admits Homafra Peria that he really did pay it back. And why does he say I didn't pay it back? Because he wants to borrow a second time on the same day. Remember that we had said a couple of weeks ago that a borrower is the one who has to pay the sofer. So let's say it cost a few dollars. To him, every dollar was important. So he's saying to himself, you know what? I'm borrowing the same amount of money, same circumstance, same everything. Why do I need to write a second star and pay the sofer another $5? I mean, it's hard for me to do that. So Rav Kana is saying there's a hava amina that it did happen on the same day, and that the lova would say, I didn't pay him back in order to, he really paid him back, but he'll say, I didn't pay him back so that he can re-roll the scenario back to the earlier that day in the AM, this is the PM, and say, okay, I'm borrowing $100. So because of that, we're afraid that he might do that. Therefore, we say that no. So therefore, the debtor admitting is a case where he really admits, and therefore we give it to the creditor. You see, because we have a havamina that he might try to pull one and say, you know what, it's all the same. Everything is the same. I returned it in the morning because I didn't need it. And in the evening, I found out that I need that same $100. So I'm just going to go back to the same guy and say, do me a favor. Let's make believe we never did it. I mean, it's seicheldik. It's all happening in a few hours. Let's just forget that you gave me the money. Okay, forget about it, that I paid you. Here, just lend me the money again. We have the documents. So because of that, we're afraid that might happen. So Rav Kana says, because he's Maida, and we're not worried about the rewrite. Kamash Malon, in Kain, Malva Gufa, Lo Shova. He says, we're not afraid of that. Why? Because if that happens, the Malva himself will not allow it. In other words, the same loan on the same day of the same amount, Malva won't go for it. Why? Sova Shimi Beirabonon, he's afraid that the word will get to the rabbis, meaning the Bezdin. You know what? Reuven lent Shimon paid him back, and now he's borrowing again using the same document. Umafsidale. So the Rabbanim will come and say, Posel, we can't use that document. And now the Malva is out of luck, because if the Lova doesn't pay him, he can't go to the Lekuchin. He can no longer go to the sort of the endorsers, if you will, those who bought the property, and he has a shtar shibud. That shtar shibud is no longer valid. So who's going to lose? The Malva is going to lose. So the Malva says, no dice. I'm not allowing you to borrow money twice on the same document. So that's the teretz. The teretz, says Rav Kana, is really the Lova admitted that he didn't pay, therefore it goes to the Malva. Maybe he admitted so that he could borrow a second time. And for the Gemara, the Malva won't allow it, because the Malva is afraid that if he does that and somehow it leaks out that he did it, the rabbis will come and nullify his shtar. Now he'll be a Malva Ba'al Peh. He will be a lender orally without any security, and he'll be the loser if the Lokeach doesn't pay. So he's not taking that chance, the Lova. He's not taking that chance. And therefore, Rav Kana says an admission by the Lova that he didn't pay is a valid way of saying it goes to the Malva. So you have to understand the Seichel here. It seems on its face very simple. What do you mean the Lova admitted? If the Lova, if the Lova admitted, what Chiddush? The Chiddush is, and this is important because we're going to see now going forward, the Chiddush is that the Malva will not allow a shtar to be written, a loan to be made again on the same documents to protect his own interest.
Rabbi, excuse me.
Yeah.
If he's paid back the Malva,
The Lova is paid back the Malva, right?
yeah, at 10 o'clock in the morning, he gets the shtar, he borrows at 9, and at 11, he was using it as a bridge loan.
Right, and he had a windfall and he got the $100 from somewhere else. He says, thank you very much.
He paid him back. So the Malva knows that he got paid back already.
Right.
So why would the Malva be afraid that he could use the shtar again and borrow at 2 o'clock in the afternoon $100? He has a kosher shtar that hasn't been ripped up or anything done to it.
Right.
Why shouldn't it work?
Because the halacha is that, yes, on paper, it looks so simple and easy and nobody's harmed. You're right, on paper. But the halacha is that when you write such a shtar, you have in mind a specific loan. The loan that was made at 9 o'clock in the morning. That's the loan that you wrote the shtar for. Once that loan is repaid, that shtar has no validity. Even if everything that was done at 9 o'clock is done at 2 o'clock, the shtar itself, the intent of the shtar was to cover a loan earlier in the day.
What's the Bezdin afraid of here? The Malva knows that he got paid back. Why is the Bezdin taking on this job of saying a blanket ruling? You can only use it once.
Because it's, you know why? Because it's very, very simple in this case. You're right. In this case, it's a no-brainer. But what happens if it isn't a no-brainer? Now you got to start fitting the pieces together. Oh, okay. In other words, if it's that simple and every case was that simple, then keep using the same shtar and shtar and shtar
Right.
again.
It becomes a slippery. It becomes a slippery slope.
Slippery slope. Right.
Right. The case gets a little more complicated, and then it's not such an easy
Easy
answer.
fit to say that that's
Right.
exactly what happened. So therefore, we make the general rule, don't use it, start again, and you'll never run into a problem.
But the Lova always has the option to go to Bezdin and say, look, I paid him back at 10 o'clock in the morning for the thing. And one would have to swear that he paid it back, and it would normally go away. And the shtar still wasn't used.
No, but Jay, you're right. In a specific case where everything is so ironclad and airtight, it might work. But Yale made the good point. If you open it up as a generality, you may use the same shtar chov a second time. Someone's going to say, sure, I borrowed $100.70, but I'm using the shtar chov that says $100. In other words, once it isn't so identical on all fours, you open up the opportunity for fraud, even if in a perfect case, it works. But in generality, this now becomes as you say, a slippery slope. It becomes an opportunity for fraud. Therefore, the Bezdin says, you know what? One and done. You use it, it's over. You want to do it again, write it again. The poor guy can't afford the $5 for the cipher. So remember in the previous Gemara, what happens? He borrowed that extra $5 from the Malvet. And when he paid him the $100, he hadn't paid him the $5 for the sofer. So the Malva still held on to the shtar because even though the shtar said $100 and he was repaid $100, but he still owed him the $5 from the sofer. So he didn't return the shtar to him. We had that case earlier. So you see, everything has to be fit in nicely into on the pages. And then there is no problem. Once you start pulling and pushing and tugging, $5 here, $10 there, now the whole thing is hefker. And then it becomes a more complicated way of dealing. So the Gemara says very simply, don't do it. Now, once you don't do it, then of course it becomes clear that if the Love admits that I didn't repay him, no problem. Now we give it to the Malve. You're the creditor. You lost the shtar. It's yours until he pays. Because again, the Malve doesn't want to take a chance to do something out of the box, because if he is found out, then the whole thing comes crashing down on him. And now the Lova can say, sorry, my friend, I don't have the money. You sold your property to Levi. Sorry, there's no shtar shibud. There's no shtar shibud here because it fell apart. So therefore, the Malva will protect his own interest and he will insist on a new shtar. Now, it's not so simple. Let's go weiter. Okay, so we had said that Rashi last week. Okay, now let's go weiter. Frag the Gemara, Maishno Mahaidetnan. Wait a minute. Why is it different than what we learned in the Mishnah? Which Mishnah? Our own Mishnah back on Yud Beis. What did we say in that Mishnah? What's a shtar chov? If someone found a shtar chov, im yesh b'machrayis nechasim, says the Mishnah there. If it has a shibud, achrayis nechasim, an endorsement to other property, lo yachzir, then you don't return it. And how do we conclude that Gemara? And we said that case was where the lover did admit that he borrowed, but we're afraid mishum shema kosav v'lova benissen v'lo lova ad tishrei v'also lemitrach lekuchos benissen v'ad tishrei shelo kedim. Right. So what do we say in that Mishnah, that you don't return it to the malveh, even though the lova said, but I borrowed, because we're afraid of the Nisan Tishrei situation where you write a shtar for Nisan, you don't exercise it, and you exercise it 6 months later in Tishrei. Now, what happens to all of the lekuchos who bought property from the debtor? Let's say he's a big businessman and he keeps and he borrows and he has debts and he has lekuchos and he sells property. Between Nisan and Tishrei, he could have sold a half a dozen properties which are not available to the malveh because the loan wasn't made. It's made in Tishrei, and he has a shtar that says, listen, he's going to start collecting from all these lekuchos improperly. That's why that Mishnah says you cannot return it to the malveh. Frek the Gemara, v'lo amrinam. Wait a minute. Why do you have to give that reason? V'lo amrinam the imkain malveh gufa lo shaveh. The omalei shtar achwina b'tishrei. The Dilma Shamay Rabbanan Mafsadle. Wait a minute, we have a perfect teretz. You know why you don't return it to him? Because he would never allow it. Why don't we say he would never allow it? We just got through saying that in the case where you had a loan that was repaid, you can't use the same shtar because the malva protects his interest. Why don't you give that teretz? The malva would never allow, he would never do it because he had once word gets out, his shtar is null and void, he's got nothing. And we don't give that teretz. So you see the teretz of Shavuk isn't such a strong teretz. Because otherwise use it in that Mishnah and say, what do you mean? The malva will never go along with this. He's afraid that the word will leak out. And once it leaks out, he loses everything. Even what's legitimate, he loses. So he won't take that chance. Why would he take that chance? That's the Gemara's kasha. Right? He'll say, write another shtar in Tishrei. Let's get a new shtar. In other words, remember, he wrote it in Nisan and he wants to exercise it in Tishrei. He'll go to the Lova and says, forget about the Nisan shtar. You never borrowed. Let's write a new shtar today in Tishrei. The Dilma Shamei Rabbanan, because if he doesn't and he works on the Nisan shtar, then the rabbis will hear, Umafsadele, and he will lose because he now will not be able to collect anything. So the kasha is, if you say that the malva protects his interests, and you gave me a good example where he wouldn't allow for the use of a shachov a second time, then why in the Mishnah back that we learned back in Yud Beis, why did we say the same thing? We trust him because he would never allow it. Why do we worry about a Nisan Tishrei shtar? He'll never allow it. He'll say, write another shtar in Tishrei. Let's do it again. No loan was consummated back in Nisan when we wrote this. Let's just forget about it and write a new one. Gemara doesn't, and the Mishnah doesn't give that teretz. So that's a problem, because if it's such a strong argument, make the argument. That's the kasha. And for the Gemara, no. There's a difference between the Mishnah's case and our case. The Mishnah's case, Omrei Hossam, there in the Mishnah, Mushum de Islay Ravcha. This is a very strong indictment of human nature. Okay, very strong indictment. Hossam Mushum de Islay Ravcha, the Kotorah of Lekuchos and Menisan La Tishrei, Menech Lichale, Veloy Oma Veloy Midi. Listen to this. Yeah, this fellow's a fine guy. He's a good man. He's an honest man. But the temptation, if you write that predated shtar, he could earn a windfall. He has 6 months worth of open time where he can collect from the lekuchos, even though it's illegal because there was no loan made. The pull of that illegality makes the malva say, you know what? I'm going to take a chance. I'm going to go through with it. And I'm going to tell the lova, just be quiet, don't say anything. It'll never come to the rabbis, and they'll never know to passel hishtar. So the lure of making this quick money illegally will pull him to accept that shtar. That's what the Gemara is telling us. In other words, human nature being what it is, if you have an open opportunity to make a windfall and you look left and you look right and nobody's looking, then you say, okay, I'll get away with it. I'll get away with it. But look what I can earn. There's so much I can earn because all of those lekuchos between Nisan and Tishrei are now available to me to grab their property with my shtora. So therefore, the Gemara says, human nature being what it is, we can't say that teretz over there, that in a predated shtar, that malve shavik, the malve is going to protect his own interest because he'll take a chance. Okay, I'll be very careful. It won't come to the rabbis, and they will never know. But hacha, in the case of Rabbi Yochanan, given the Leslei Ravcha, what benefit will he get if, in the case where I borrowed $100, I repaid it, I want to borrow another $100, and I want to use the same shtar? What benefit is there to the malve? The malve gets no benefit. He has the same $100 and the same shtar. There's no windfall to him. In that case, the Tishrei Melech Nichale, the sof shtar ha'idna ksiv, ma'ika de tarif, lekuchas b'shtar, shenimchel shibudu lo shavik. In other words, in this particular case, because he cannot gain anything by using the same shtar, he'll say to the lover, write me a new shtar. It's the same $100, but write me a new shtar. I don't want to be risking because he doesn't make a profit. When you make a profit, you're willing to take risks. That's the Gemara's analysis of human nature, which is unfortunately true, that when the bigger the potential pot, the greater a person may, not us, we're tzaddikim, but may be willing to take the risk and do something slightly improper because the reward is worth the risk. But where the reward is not worth the risk, because all he's going to do is write the same shtar for the same $100, he's not going to allow the lover to use the same shtar a second time. Therefore, says the Gemara, you can't learn from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah is a different set of circumstances, and there the principle of lo shavik doesn't apply, because a malva may take the risk. Whereas in Rabbi Yochanan's case, he won't take the risk because there's no reward. No risk, no reward. He won't get anything. Might as well write another shtar and force the lover to write another shtar for the same $100 that he borrowed earlier in the day. That's how the Gemara says it. So Rashi says, my ika the Torah for kufos, my Torah yesh possess lo yeh b'shtar yishiyachza b'yichtav lo v'halo shneim b'yoyim echad hilchach b'shtar shenim chol shibudo lo shavik. Therefore, with a shtar that is moichel the shibud, he won't go with it. He won't enforce it. He'll never allow it. Therefore, we say in Rabbi Yochanan's case that we return it to the malva, because the malva would never go along with such trickery for nothing, where he doesn't benefit. So that's the answer to the Gemara, and so now we've answered that question. Okay. Now, the Gemara is going to tell us very bottom of the last line of Yud Zayin and Aleph. Now that we're talking about Rabbi Yochanan and what Rabbi Yochanan told us, Amar Rabbi Chia Ba'aba Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Chia Ba'aba says in the name of Yochanan, he makes another pronouncement, and he says as follows: Hatoen achamasa bezdin. If someone wants to collect after a court certified document, let's say, and he says, okay, so what does it mean? Look at Rashi at the bottom of Yud Zayin and Aleph. Rashi says, what does it mean? Something that is an obligation of Bezdin. That's what he means by Masa Bezdin, an obligation of Bezdin. But Bezdin gives an edict, and he gives an example. Ksuba, Mazon ha'isha v'habonos, right? The sustenance of the wife and the children in the event of a divorce or a death of the Baal. Hatoe Lama parati, if the okay, in this case, let's say it was a divorce. It could be a death too, because you could talk about Yarshim, but let's just talk about a divorce. He divorces her, and now he has to pay the ksuba. If he says, oh, wait a minute, I paid my wife, my ex-wife, this money. I followed the ksuba, I did it. And it's not done in front of witnesses, loy amaklum. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's pronouncement, that in the case of a masa bezdin, and the example he gives is a ksuba, but we'll see other examples, then loy omar klum, he doesn't, it's as if he didn't say anything. So you have to have witnesses who will claim it. Loy omar klum. So what's the pshat loy omar klum? So the Gemara, my tama, what's the reason? Kol masa bezdin, says the Gemara, command the noket shtore biyodei. Every masa bezdin is like you put a star in his hands. So what does that mean? Okay, so let's analyze when you borrow money or when you get money. Then there's two ways. Principally, you can borrow money with a star and without a star. What does that mean? I come to you and I say, Jay, lend me $100. And you say, yeah, but it's just the two of us. So you know what? We're going to bring in Irv and Chaim. You're the two witnesses. And you're going to see that I'm $100. Okay, fine. Now I have my two witnesses and I know that you owe me the $100. Fine, good. If I come back to you, Jay, and I give you the $100 and Chaim and Irv are not there, and then I say, but Jay, I paid you, you believe me. The Bezdin believes me. If it was done in front of two witnesses and I pay you back, I'm believed. Scenario two, I come to you, Jay, lend me $100. You say, sure. And we write a star, right? We write a star. I borrowed on Sunday morning. I borrowed whatever it was. I borrowed $100. And then I come back, but Jay, I paid you. Okay, okay. I paid you already. So where's the receipt? What do you mean receipt? We did it by star. You can't just ignore the star. You have to have a receipt or you have to have the star back, the loan document. Because normally you'd give me the loan back document or you'd write me a receipt, paid $100. Says, in that circumstance, I owe you the $100. So we see two scenarios, one with a star, one without a star. Without a star, I can get away with saying I paid you. With a star, I can't. So the Gemara says, this is important, why in the case of the ksuba, it's a masa bezdin, why is he not believed without witnesses? In other words, in a case with a star, if I come back to you and Chaim and Irv are there, and I say, you know that star that we wrote? I'm paying you back. But you didn't give me back the star. But the two witnesses saw that I paid you back. That's okay. So the two witnesses can be in place of the star, but you have to have the witnesses. Whereas in the case of the witnesses, you don't have to have anybody. Right? Why? Because when the Bezdin makes an edict, it's as if there's a star. There isn't a star, but it's as if there is a star. So therefore, now just words alone don't work. Okay, that's what the Gemara, the edict of the Gemara. Now we understand. Now, Omar Rabbi Yochanan. So that's what Rabbi Hyatt said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Comes Rabbi Hyatt and he says to Rabbi Yochanan, wait a minute, Rabbi Yochanan, what are you being mechadish here? Zu. What are you telling me here? You're telling me a chiddush that it's like a star and you can't do it. It's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says in Ksubis, Hotzi get be'enimo ksuba. Okay, when a person gets married, what does he do? He writes a ksuba, and the ksuba is given to the wife, and this is her document that, God forbid, if the husband dies or if there's a divorce, she has a document in hand from which she can collect, right? That's her document. And normally when she collects from the ksuba, then you give the ksuba back to the husband, to the Baal, and he rips it up or whatever he does with the ksuba, and the ksuba is no longer in force, but you have to return the ksuba. Says the Mishnah there, I want to look at that Mishnah in a minute because it's important. And he says, Hotzi get ve'ein imo ksuba, gova ksubasa. If he gives her, if all there is a get, he gave her a get. Now he has to pay the ksuba, but there's no ksuba. Why? Because it was in a place where they don't write ksubas. I don't know, it could be Timbuktu. They didn't write a ksuba, but you have the get. So in that case, gova ksubasa. So I'm looking from the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Perek Tes and Ksubas says, Hotzi get ve'ein imo ksuba. And so the Bartanura, Isha sheyesh, so we're reading here from the Mefarshim, Isha sheyesh biyoda get ve'ein lo shtar ksuba. If she doesn't have a shtar ksuba, she didn't get one. Going b'makom she'en ksuvim ksuba. In a place where they don't write ksubas. I don't know where that is, but there's places where they don't write a ksuba. All she has is a get. Gova ksubasa, hainu ikar haksuba. The get is the ksuba. The fact that she got the get means she's owed that money. So instead of taking the ksuba and giving it back, she has to give the get back, and he can rip the get. So when you get the get back and you rip the get, that's a siman that you paid the ksuba, right? Why is that so? The Mefarshim explain, Mitneshu Tanai Bezdin. Because it's a Tanai Bezdin. It's a obligation of Bezdin, just like our Rashi. It's an obligation of Bezdin. V'osim siman beget shenifalo ksubasa kilo kidei shelo tagbiya shenis. And you rip the get, so she can't come back a second time and collect. So now you see from that Mishnah that what? That a Tanai Bezdin, you can collect. So what's Rabbi Yochanan's chiddush? Rabbi Yochanan just told us a gewaldige chiddush that if you have a Tanai Bezdin, it's like a document. Wait a minute, the Mishnah says that. The Mishnah says that in Ksubas. So what chiddush are you telling me, right? So now here we have a response, and Rabbi Yochanan said, again, sometimes give us these gems that we have to appreciate.
Excuse me.
Then Omalei, yeah.
So, but the get had Adam. What is the role of the Adam?
The Adam were only Ede Gittin. The Ede Gittin had nothing to do with the Ksuba. So in the case where in
a town where they don't like to do Ksubas, the
right.
Adam of the get
are the Ede Ksuba
can testify that she hasn't been paid the ksuba yet.
Well, the Adam of the get can only say that it's a valid get. The only way they weren't present. In other words, the Ade get say this is a valid get, and therefore a ksuba is owed.
It implies that there was a ksuba, and we
correct.
believe it if it's in a town where the ksuba isn't written, and then they'll immediately strike out the get so that she can't come a second time.
Right, but the Ade get cannot comment on whether the ksuba was paid.
Right, they had nothing to do with that.
They're not involved in that. So Ade get are fine. Now the question is, was she paid on the ksuba? So the Gemara says,
but don't they also bring the ksuba to the get, to the Bezdin when they're writing a get?
Different Adim. Normally there's different Adim on a ksuba. There's different Adim on the ksuba as on a get. But the Adim themselves are irrelevant because no one is arguing that there wasn't a ksuba. We're saying that there was a ksuba or there was a get in lieu of a ksuba. No problem. No one's arguing that. The question is, because it's a Tanai Bezdin, if the husband says, but I paid you, not good enough. Because remember what I said, that if you borrow with witnesses, you can say I paid without witnesses. If you borrowed with a document, you can't say I paid without witnesses. You have to have the witnesses, and the Eidei Get are not the witnesses of payment. They're just the Edom of the get, not the Edom of the witnesses. But so look what Rabbi Yochanan comes. Amalei Rabbi Yochanan says, this is beautiful language. Ilav de Deloy lo chaspa lo mishkachas masnitten tusa. If not for my Rabbi Yochanan's words of wisdom, you wouldn't have known it from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah is like a rock or a shard or something that covers up a pearl, and my Chiddush lifted up the rock, and now the pearl is visible. So he's giving a very flowery way of saying the Mishnah doesn't cut it. From the Mishnah, you can't know my Chiddush. In other words, but for, you would have thought in the case of the Mishnah is talking about a ksuba. But what about every other case in the world other than the ksuba? Says Rabbi Yochanan, you need my interpretation to do it. That's his answer. All right. Ilav the doyle chaspa lo mishkachas misnita tusa. You would never have uncovered the pearl of what I am saying. So, okay. So okay. In this flowery context, Rabbi Yochanan is saying the Mishnah is not telling it all. Okay. So let's just look at the top Rashi there. B'makom she'en kosvin ksuba ela somchen al tanai bezdin. You're somech on the, remember tanai bezdin. The tigva la'olam, and she can always collect at sheyotza habal shoiver the get until he brings a torn get. Shemeyed shegir shehu mochiach shechayev hu lo ksuba. So in other words, in the case where there is no ksuba, the get is the ksuba, and it's unpaid until there's a rip in the get, which shows that the ksuba was paid. So now she can't come back. Ilo nokitla, because ilo nokitla lo gave, that she can't collect. Imishum b'chashinan dilma hadra umafke ksuba b'gave zimna achriti. Either we're afraid that that she'll collect a second time. Inami mishum di boy oma parata. He can come and say, I paid you. So in other words, we have to have the actual proof. Because it's a Tanai Bezdin, we can't just rely on I paid you. I paid you doesn't cut it. There has to be some kind of a siman that it was paid, and therefore we accept it. So, okay, so that's the situation there. Now, so Rabbi Yochanan says, my Chiddush is valid. Comes Abaya. This is very interesting. Oma Abaya. Mar Marganisa. You're telling me, Rabbi Yochanan, that but for my Chiddush, you wouldn't have been able to learn it from the Mishnah. Right? That's what you're saying. Abaya asks a more intrinsic question. My Marganita, what you're telling me, Rabbi Yochanan, that but for me, you wouldn't have been able to learn it from the Mishnah. What could you have learned from the Mishnah anyway? So Abaya is arguing that Rabbi Yochanan, yes, Rabbi Yochanan, you're telling me a Chiddush that you didn't learn from the Mishnah. And he's saying, wait a minute, the Mishnah doesn't talk about this. This is not, you can't learn anything from the Mishnah. It's not that Rabbi Yochanan is telling me something more than the Mishnah is telling me. From the Mishnah alone, you would never have gotten it. You would never have understood it. Why? Dilma b'mokim she'en kosvin ksuba askinan. Maybe the reason in the Mishnah, what the Mishnah is talking about, is in a place where they don't write a ksuba. The get hanu ksubasa. Aber b'mokim she'kosvin ksuba, but in a place where you do write a ksuba, inikita ksuba gave, ilo lo gave. But where a ksuba is written, then when you bring it in, you collect, and if not, you don't collect. So it has nothing to do with Tanai Bezdin. In other words, a ksuba is a document, okay? When you have a document, an IOU, then what's the normal course of events? You want to get paid, you bring in the document, and the document is taken back, a receipt is given, or it's ripped up, whichever, and then it's consummated. The deal is finished because you got paid. So how do I know a chiddush that a court, a Masa Bezdin is ironclad, and you're telling me I know it from the Mishnah, but the Mishnah is speaking about a get, not a ksuba, where the get was given, and therefore he's collecting on the get. Wait a minute. In the case of the Mishnah, if there was a ksuba, then either you collect or you don't collect. If you have the ksuba, you collect. If you don't have the ksuba, you don't collect. So where's the chiddush from the Mishnah that a Masa Bezdin is a Tanai that you don't need the document? Of course you need the document. You always need the document. The only exception is a get, where ksuba wasn't written and you have the get. That's the exception to the rule. But the rule still is that you need the document. How can you tell me that a document is in lieu, that a Masa Bezdin, it's like witnesses, it's as good as having witnesses there, because and without it you can't without the document you can't collect. Wait a minute. If I come and say I paid. Only a get is different because a get takes the role of a get is a stronger document, so it's unusual. So with a get, I say, okay, you have to have the intrinsic proof. But without a get, if it's just a ksuba, then you have to show me the document. If you don't show me the document, you don't get paid. And here we're saying, Rabbi Yochanan says, a Masa Bezdin, you don't need the document. It's as if you have the document. You don't need the document, says Rabbi Yochanan. Where in the Mishnah can you even extrapolate that? That doesn't work. So Rabbi's kasha is, you have a kasha. What does Rabbi Yochanan be mechadish on the Mishnah? You know what Rabbi Yochanan is being mechadish on the Mishnah? Plenty. Because without Rabbi Yochanan, we wouldn't know that in every case where there is a document, then it's solid. And you can't say I just paid, where it's a Masa Bezdin. Why? Because the Mishnah's case is strictly speaking about a get, nothing else. But in the case of a ksuba, if I didn't have the document, we wouldn't say, oh, it's Masa Bezdin, therefore you don't believe the husband when he says paid. You do believe him when he says there's paid, because there's no ksuba anymore. She doesn't have the ksuba, meaning supposedly that she gave the ksuba to the husband and the husband disposed of it. So the kasha here that Abaye is saying is, Rabbi Chia Ba'aba, are asking a question on Rabbi Yochanan. What chiddush, Rabbi Yochanan, do you bring here? We have a Mishnah. So he says, Abaye says, wait a minute, you could never have learned that from the Mishnah. The Mishnah doesn't talk about that. So Rabbi Yochanan's chiddush is a big chiddush. That's what he's asking. He's asking on the underlying question of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, you can't learn from the Mishnah what Rabbi Yochanan is telling us. That's Abaye's kasha. Because
a get doesn't have to be a Masa Bezdin, right? I mean, a man gives a get to a woman in front of two witnesses. He doesn't require a Bezdin for that, does he?
The get, yes, of course he does.
Bezdin, when he hands the get in front of two witnesses?
No. But the whole Indian of the get, when it's written and given in a place where there's no ksuba, we're talking about a place where no ksuba is written. So when that get is written in front of Bezdin, it's also a ksuba. It's also a ksuba, right? Now he hands her, in front of witnesses, of course, he hands her the document, and in that case we say that if the husband comes and says I paid, it's not sufficient. It's not sufficient because it's a court-ordered document, and therefore it has to be done. There has to be proof. You can't just say I paid. But says Abaye, in a case where they do write ksubas, so the get is the get. Fine, that's a good document. But with the ksuba, where's the beef? Where's the ksuba? No ksuba, no collection. So in that case, you wouldn't say that something that is a Tanai Bezdin, automatically you don't believe the Baal, because you do believe the Baal. If you don't deliver the ksuba, you believe the Baal to say I paid. So in other words, The kasha is from the Mishnah. I could not have learned this klal that a Tanai Bezdin is an automatic without the document. Of course, you need the document. You need the ksuba. Without the ksuba, you don't get paid. Get is a different animal. Get, forget about get. Get is an unusual thing, but a ksuba. So the kasha then is, why are you even having a half a minute to say Rabbi Hyatt that Rabbi Yochanan is superfluous? Of course, he's not superfluous. From the Mishnah, I wouldn't have learned this tremendous pearl of a chiddush that Rabbi Yochanan is telling us. That's the pshat. So Rabbi Yochanan says, I am uncovering with a pearl under a rock in the bottom of the ocean because I'm telling you such a tremendous chiddush. That's what he's. So Rabbi Yochanan is saying. Okay, so that's what Abaye is saying. That your kasha Rabbi Yochanan is not a kasha because from the Mishnah I would never have learned it. That's what he's trying to say. But wait a minute. So then Abaye slept on it. Hoda Oma Abaye lav milsihi. Now Abaye comes back the next morning and says, forget about my kasha. My kasha that I asked on the Mishnah is not a kasha. In other words, Rabbi Hyatt Ba'avin had a good kasha on Rabbi Yochanan. I have a Mishnah. What's the chiddush? So now Abaye is retracting his kasha. Why is he retracting his kasha? Why is he retracting? The isol kedata b'makom shein kosem ksuba askinan. Because if you are telling me that the Mishnah is speaking about a case where they don't write a ksuba, but in the place where they write a ksuba, ksuba gave ilo lo gave. In other words, that's what I said yesterday, and that was the proof to Rabbi Yochanan. No way. Why? Look at this situation. Almona mina erison b'mai gave, bade mises baal. Litan v'lema parate. Okay, so now we have to understand a little bit of noshim. We have a system today where erison and asuin are done under the chuppah. When you go to a wedding, what do you see? Hariat mikadeshes li. Okay, that's erison. When a man gives a woman a shava pruta, that's called erison. Fine. Now, there's another step to that. It's called Nesuin. We do Nesuin at the same time as Erison. There was once upon a time where Erison was complete and the parties went home. It was Erev Shabbos, they went home. Motzei Shabbos, they did Nesuin. What's Nesuin? He came back and he gave her the ksuba and he took her into his home. In other words, they lived as husband and wife. That's called Nesuin. So wait a minute. You have Erison and no Nesuin. Comes Abaye and he says, what does he say? Now what? There was Erison, and Rahman al-Islam, he died over Shabbos. He gave her Erison, and on Shabbos he died. Comes Motzei Shabbos, what happens? There's no Nesuin. She's an almana min ha'erison. She's an almana from an engagement. What we call an engagement, min ha'erison. Does she collect a ksuba or not? That's the question here. Is there a ksuba? But my gave bade Mrs. Baal. So l'chore, there is something called a ksuba for an almana, for a erison. But wait a minute. The husband, the yarshim come b'lema parate. Now it comes before Bezdin on Monday morning, and she says, I'm collecting my ksuba. And the Yarshim said, but we paid you on Sunday. We paid you already. We gave you the ksuba. Now, right? So that now you have a shaila. What happens? And if you say, hachanami, we believe the Yarshim to say they paid, imkain maha ilu chachamim b'takanton. What did the chachamim accomplish with their takana? That a woman who is an almana mina erison collects, how can she collect if they can say parate. If they can say parate and they don't need witnesses, what's the point? Elamai, we have to say that the takonos chachamim, that almona min ha'erisin is valid. And therefore it's a shtar. And with a shtar, you need witnesses. So that's how Abaye is retracting his position. Abaye rethought his point that from the Mishnah, I could never have learned this great chiddush. Why? Because it only refers to a case where a get is a ksuba. But where the get is not the ksuba, and you have to pay on the ksuba, you show me the document. You don't show me the document, we don't believe you. And here, by almona min ha'erisin, we're saying that he believes her. She didn't get the ksuba yet. The ksuba wasn't handed to her. So, but she's tining, I'm an almona, I'm entitled to the ksuba. He says, but I paid you on the ksuba. Where's it? Show me the ksuba, bring me the ksuba. And she has no ksuba to bring. If you believe the yarshim, then it would be a raya that what? That there is no payment, that you don't need Eidim. Elomai, that's what the Gemara says. What's the point of the takana that she gets a ksuba if the ksuba wasn't handed? You don't need witnesses. Teretz is you need the witnesses. Now he's back to saying that the Mishnah does talk about a case where there is the requirement of collection without a document. And then Rabbi Yochanan argues on it and says, no, you wouldn't have known it from the Mishnah. But the Mishnah is a valid source of that argument. That's all Abaye wants to show here, because he slugged up the Mishnah and said, from the Mishnah, I could never have learned that subject. Comes Abaye and says, I retract. Yes, you could have learned it from the Mishnah. And Rabbi Yochanan comes and says, okay, you couldn't, I argue. But the point here is that Abaye is retracting and is telling us that in this case of almana mina erisin, you don't require the document, because otherwise, what's the takana? All right, so let's just finish this thought. Omale Mark Shisha, Bered Rav Chizda Ravashi. Almana mina erisin is like suba minolan. Okay, I heard what Abaye just said. Abaye said, I'm retracting my point because of this case of almana mina erisin. Correct the Gemara. And how do you actually know that almana mina erisin gets a ksuba? So let's get to the source. How does Abaye even come to know that an almana mina erisin gets a ksuba? Maybe she doesn't. Maybe if it's not consummated, there's no ksuba. How do you know it? Minolon. Now, if you're going to say it's from that Mishnah in Ksubas, Nis Armala or Nis Garsha, Bein Mina Erison, or Bein Mina Nasuin, Goves Hakol, there is a Mishnah that says a woman who was widowed or divorced, Bein Mina Erison, whether it was only at the time of Erison, Bein Min Hanasuin, or from the actual Nasuin, Goves Hakol. She collects everything, right? So you have a Meferish Mishnah. The Mishnah says, if you're going to say that's the source of why you Abaye say that there is a ksuba from the Erison, Dilma Hecha de Kosovla, Dilma Hecha de Kosovla. It's like Dilma Hecha de Kosovla. Maybe that's only valid when he writes the ksuba. But if he hasn't yet written the ksuba, in other words, when was he going to write the ksuba? When he did the nesuin. So the Mishnah is telling us, yes, a mana min ha'erisin collects if the ksuba was written. But if the ksuba wasn't written, then she doesn't collect. Then v'chitema mala memra. And you're going to say, so why bother writing it? What's the chiddush? Why would you tell me that it only works with a writing? The Mishnah doesn't say that. The Mishnah says, Isha shenis armala on his garsha, bein mina erison, bein mina sun goves hakol, collects everything. Doesn't that imply that it doesn't say here only when he wrote it Arison. Doesn't say that he had to have written it for the Arison. It just says that if she's an almana min Arison, she collects. You want to make a distinction as to whether he wrote the ksuba or didn't write the ksuba. That's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says that if she's an almana from the Arison, she automatically collects. So what's the chiddush? And if but you're going to tell me that, you know what? There's a reason why it says that, because it excludes Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who says, the Omar, Shelo kosav lo ela almanas lekunsa. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah had a different take on the Mishnah. He said, I will give you a ksiba. In other words, Friday he gave her the Arison, then came Shabbos. You don't have a chasen on Shabbos. Matzah Shabbos, he's going to give her the Nesuin. And he says, then I'll give you the ksuba almanas lekonsa, on the condition that we enter into the nesuin. In other words, when I take you into my house, then the ksuba will be valid. But if I don't take you into my house, then you don't get a ksuba. So he says that Mishnah has to exclude Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, that we don't hold like him. We don't hold that you can make a ksuba almanas. So there's no such thing as a ksuba almanas. Therefore, we see itzrucha. That so we need to have this Mishnah, and therefore it's a raya to Abaya that in an Arison, almona min Arison is a valid document. Almona min Garrison, it's a valid ksuba, and when the Yarshim come on Sunday after the father died, they say we paid. We don't believe him. Therefore, Abaya's rehabilitation of the Mishnah is complete, because the whole kasha was Abaya negated the Mishnah, and so there's no chiddush. The Torah says there is a tremendous chiddush from Rabbi Yochanan, because Abaya rehabilitated the Mishnah by telling us that almana min ha'erison you do collect. Why? Because notwithstanding Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, who says that you don't collect only if you consummate, he says you collect even if you don't consummate, which means that the witnesses, the Yarshim, have to have witnesses even without the ksuba, because she doesn't yet have the ksuba. But it's as if she had the ksuba and she can collect on it. Therefore, you see that the Tanai Bezdin, because the ksuba is a Tanai Bezdin, therefore, we see a Tanai Bezdin is so strong that you don't have to have the documents. It's if you have the document. And that's what Abaya says. And that's why he rehabilitates the Mishnah. And there's no kasha from the Almana Mina Erison, because Almana Mina Erison, even though she doesn't have the ksuba yet, she still collects some of the ksuba. And you need to have witnesses that it was paid. Without witnesses that it was paid, we don't believe that it was paid, and we hold that she has to be repaid. So we're back to what we said before, that the Mishnah is a valid Mishnah, but Rabbi Yochanan says, and Rabbi Yochanan is the only one. He comes and says, but for the Mishnah, you wouldn't know my halacha. Abaya says, well, the Mishnah is a valid Mishnah. It does tell us that. So there's a little bit of a friction there, because Rabbi Yochanan wanted to override the Mishnah. But here, Abaya comes and tells us that the Mishnah is valid. So let's take a quick look at Rashi to finish this.
How do we know how much money there would have been in the ksuba?
Oh, so it's a good question, because so we say, interesting. The Mishnah says Gove es hakol. Normal ksuba is 100 zuz for a woman who is previously married, she's not a virgin, and 200 for a psula. That's the normal. But on top of that, he could have promised her houses and cars and everything else. So when the Mishnah says hakol, it's everything that he would have promised. But at the very least, the 200 zuz. In other words, let's say she's a psula, so it's what would have been written in the ksuba. Now you're right. If we don't know what's written in the ksuba, then we can't give her more than the basic. But at least the basic 200 zuz was a lot of money in those days. So at least she gets the 200 zuz. The children want to deny her the 200 zuz and say, we paid you the 200 zuz already.
You can also go to Bezin and say, he offered me houses and a vacation. You can end up with a big machlokus with the
He need witnesses for that.
What?
She would need witnesses for that.
He would need witnesses for that,
Nobody
right?
Nobody expected him to die. I mean, this is a,
That's right. That's right. That's
Right.
they would expect him to die. But you see, Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah is excluded because he even said that that ksuba was a Tanai ksuba, and we don't hold like that. We don't hold that a ksuba. Now today by the way, one of the reasons why today we have erison and nesuin at one time is for the very reason that we don't want to separate them and create all kinds of possibilities. Which is why, very interesting that in circumstances where a woman is engaged and you give her a ring, then that's erison, right? You give a woman, right? A guy wants to, he proposes, he gives her a ring. That's already erison. Now he breaks the engagement. What happens? There are many people who are makbid to get a get, because they say that erison already requires a get. So what do? They have the chuppah. Listen to this. They have the chuppah. They have the nesuin, but they do not live together. And he immediately writes her a get, because short of that, they argue she's an Eishes Ish. So in order to remove the cloud of Eishes Ish, Chas v'sholem, mamzerim, all these other things that could happen, they say, no, let's complete the marriage. Therefore, today, we technically, yes, we do give a ring, but since the entire erison nesuin is done under the chuppah, so in other words, we don't hold that the giving of the ring is the real erison. There are those who say that's erison, and therefore you need a get. We say no. Now, why do I say that? Because with erison, once upon a time, I remember when I was a young boy, I remember many of the yeshiva guys never who got married wrote what's called tanoim. And tanoim are technically vows that the chassan and the kala make to each other. We break the plate, we have the whole beautiful ceremony. That's erison today in our time. So what did they do? They did away with the tanoim before the chasana. You don't see it anymore. Why? For this very reason, because if you did tanoim early and you gave the ring, now you're betrothed. Now, technically, you're already together, but you need to have the nesuin. That's when the question of a get arose. And that was a serious question. I remember situations where in yeshiva, a guy, older fellow, got engaged, everything else, they broke the engagement. Now it's a whole big shiloh. What do you do? So they did away with that in many, I don't know if today, maybe among Chassidim, they may still do it, but in the yeshiva world, they don't do it anymore because of this problem. Therefore, they have the erison and the nesuin under the chuppah at one time, and you don't run into the problem. Now, of course, unfortunately, we run into many problems, and after a marriage, it doesn't last very long. But then, again, that's...
So what are they signing at the chassan tish?
They're signing vows that they are vowing to each other, which means now, and you can't, it's with the name of Hashem, so you can't, right? L'sis Hashem l'shav. You can't break that vow. It has God's name in it.
That's not called tanoim at the chassan tish?
Yeah, but
Yes,
that's right there.
But it's right there, Jay, and you go right into the marriage
I mean, unless she gets cold feet and runs right there.
under the chuppah, which maybe has happened, right? Maybe it's happened. But if he doesn't, normally once you write the tanoim, then we sing and we go right to the chuppah, and we go right to the marriage, and then you go into yichud. Yichud, now they're living together as a husband and wife, and the whole thing is done. Now, the next morning, she says, Mekach tos, what did I do getting married to this guy? He's terrible. Now I want to get. Now she's married. You have to get a get. But if it happened after the nesuin, without the, after the erison, without the nesuin, do you give a get or not? That was the whole shaila. So therefore, this Mishnah, while in those days things were done differently, because the erison and the nesuin were not done together, you see how it evolved over time in order to strengthen the bond of how marriages work. We wanted to avoid any sort of air, any time, so that you don't run into this question of, is there erison? Do we give a get? What happens if he dies? Okay, chas v'sholom, he could die, the night of the wedding. But the point is that now there was no issues because she's not an almana min ha'erison, she's an almana min hanasuin from the actual marriage. Okay, so that Rashi says, look, lav milsihi da amre. So Abaye says, wait a minute, forget about what I said yesterday. Today I'm changing my mind. And I'm saying that the Mishnah is a valid Mishnah. The b'makom shekosim shtar ksuba yochel litin parati, that you can say parati. The imkain almana min ha'erison, the afa makom shekosim ain't kosim min ha'erison. So therefore, they wouldn't write the ksuba yet min ha'erison. So how does she collect? It's a raya, says the Mishnah, that you don't need the document. Remember, that's Abaye's point here. You don't need the document because it's an almana min ha'erison. Then the Gemara afterwards says, asks the kasha, b'may gavik suba al karchach b'ademises baal litin yorish lo parati. So he said, ma b'takanton shetiknu ksuba la musa v'halo hakol yitanu parati. You make a takana that she can collect, but you're allowing him to say, I paid. Therefore, he says, no, you don't allow him to say, I paid, because the ksuba itself is the proof, and the only way to undo it is by edim. And since he says parati below edim, we don't believe him. So that's how Abaye comes back to retract the whole thing, because he says that, and then the Gemara asks the kasha, how do you know that there is such a thing as a ksuba mina erison, which we just learned? And he says, yes, there is a ksuba mina erison. Therefore, it's a solid document, and without witnesses, the Yorshim cannot say parati, because you don't need to have the document. The document has validity in and of itself. It's an intricate Gemara going back and forth, but it's a beautiful understanding of the discussion of the Amoraim as to how they weave back and forth. And again, and you say that Rabbi Elazar Azaria was a tremendous Talmud Chacham, we know from the Agada. Yet we see that his Chiddush is not accepted, that you can make it tonight. So anyway, that's how we end the Gemara. So Mitzvah Shem, next week we'll pick up.
Yeshkach.
Shkoyach, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you. What page are we starting on next week?
Next week, we're going to start from the very bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Yud Zayin Amud Beis is where we left off, so that's where we'll start next week.
Thank you.
Is Menashe on this call? Menashe, are you here?
Yeah.
Can I give you a quick call at home?
Sure.
Okay, I could ask you a question. Okay, sei gesund, everybody, and have a wonderful week.
Thank you.
Thank you.